Good morning. It is my honor and delight to be here with you this week, and if you humor me my dreary topic today, I promise things will get more fun tomorrow. I'll start by telling you a story about an Old Testament professor at my seminary who reportedly told his class, there are some stories in the Old Testament you shouldn't even try to preach. For example, he said, the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter in Judges chapter 11. Just don't go there, he advised. Several students in the class were amused by this and came to tell me about it because I'd already gone there in a sermon in chapel the year before. And I admit it's not a heartwarming story, nor an easy one to interpret. But I keep coming back to this bizarre and disturbing story again and again in my life. Now, if you're to have any hope of appreciating my morbid fascination with Jephthah's dead daughter, first we have to talk about the context of the story. Because there is this trajectory in the book of Judges that has to do with the plight of women. At the beginning of the book of Judges, we find some of the strongest and most unconventional female characters in Scripture, who all possess a will of their own. Achsah, Caleb's daughter, who, in chapter 1, who has the audacity to ask her father for land and become a landowner. Deborah, the female prophet and judge who helped lead the people in battle against their oppressors. Jael, the gutsy and cunning wife of a foreigner who single-handedly took down the great army commander Sisera. But by the end of the book, we find the absolute worst stories of violence against women in all the Bible. We have the concubine in chapter 19 who was handed over by her man to a hungry crowd of men who gang raped her all night, then left her for dead. Later, her body is chopped into 12 pieces and sent throughout the land of Israel, her story exploited to incite war. If this doesn't seem horrifying enough, the book of Judges ends with 400 nameless virgins captured from their homes while their families are slaughtered so that they might become wives for the men of Benjamin. And when those 400 aren't good enough for the men invade a village dance and each man carries off for himself the dancer he pleases and abducts a new wife for himself that way. I warned you this would get a bit dreary. The contrast between the heroines at the beginning of Judges and the unnamed victims at the end of the book could hardly be more extreme. In case you need a little refresher on the book of Judges, it's the narrative that sets us up for the arrival of King Saul and King David. Remember, the Israelite people started off as a theocracy, but by the end of the book of Judges, things are really bad and the people are desperate for a human leader. It appears that in the book of Judges, as the people's faithfulness to God declines, so does the plight of their women. The decline of woman's value from chapter 1 to chapter 21 is dramatic. And the women who show up in the narrative between these two extremes have far more ambiguous roles. Some of these women are called by name, like Delilah. Some, like Samson's mother, his first wife, and his prostitute, remain nameless. Right in the very middle of the book, in the middle of the decline in women's value, we read about Jephthah's daughter in Judges chapter 11. It is such an odd story, with Jephthah promising to sacrifice to the Lord the first thing out of his house if God helps him win the battle. Mind you, this is entirely Jephthah's idea, not God's. Jephthah wins the battle, and when he arrives home, the first thing out of his house is his only child, his beloved daughter, and Jephthah is dismayed and horrified, as if it hadn't occurred to him until that moment that the first thing out of his own house might be a human being, a human he loved. But Jephthah feels more allegiance to his own word than to his own flesh and blood. And so he goes ahead with the sacrifice. And this is how his daughter dies. Someone once asked me, where was her mother? And that question has haunted me ever since. I've written versions of the story in which Jephthah's wife pleads and begs and cries and screams, desperately trying to intervene and save her daughter's life. But she doesn't have enough power to stop him, and her efforts prove futile. I don't know if you've noticed, but there are times in life when we just aren't able to stop the evil. We don't have enough power, or we don't know what to do, or no one will listen to our protests. Whether it's watching your loved one die of cancer, or seeing the image of a Syrian toddler washed up dead on the shore and feeling helpless to do anything about it. Whether it's not being able to right a small injustice at work, or not being able to convince your country that Black lives matter, there are times in life when, despite our best efforts, bad things triumph. I was mesmerized by a Baptist Brazilian pastor I met at a conference last spring. She said that in her context, the situation is so dire that the word hope has little meaning for her anymore. The word she holds on to instead is resistance. She cannot beat the powers of violence and evil, but she can resist them. Which brings me to my favorite part in Jephthah's daughter's story, because before she dies, she insists on having 2 months to herself to wander the hills with her friends and mourn. And then after her death, for 4 days every year, the daughters of Israel will go out and lament the daughter of Jephthah. For whatever reason, these women couldn't or didn't know how to stop the murder of their friend by their theologically incompetent father. This story occurs in the narrative of Judges as women are beginning to lose their power as important partners in the shaping of society and becoming nameless victims with little to no will of their own. But these women who mourn Jephthah's daughter, despite their inability to stop injustice, refuse to let the tragedy go unacknowledged. They make a big deal out of it. They memorialize her. They don't get over it. They continue to remember. They preserve their grief for her for years to come and do not allow their tears to dry up. These women become serious practitioners of grief and lament, which is what I want to talk to you about today. Lament as a subversive form of hope. Exciting, right? I get it, no one wants to grieve. We just assume avoid pain altogether. And as a society, we're pretty good at avoiding it. We're also pretty good at it in the church. There are even some churches where you will only ever hear happy, upbeat praise songs. You won't hear the Psalms of Lament, or read the Bible's darker stories and let them be dark. You won't engage life's toughest questions and let them remain complicated and unanswered. If you're depressed or anxious, confused or doubting or hurting or grieving, you better not bring that with you to church. Church people are supposed to be happy. And yet, if you read the Psalms, you find that heart-wrenching honesty about life's struggles is very much a part of the faith. If you ever need permission to grieve or even just to whine a little, read the Psalms. What I want to suggest today is that lament is a form of hope. By contrast, denial is a form of despair. If you have to deny your pain and suffering in order to survive, that means you don't believe you can face it and still thrive. Denial is an expression of hopelessness. But lament, the practice of naming and acknowledging our sorrows before God, is the way you open the door to the possibility of genuine hope. And it is also one of the ways you refuse to give up on justice. Now, don't get me wrong. Opening the door to your grief hurts like hell and feels nothing like hope. But despite how it feels, lament is a form of radical honesty that entrusts our woundedness and the world's brokenness to a God we expect to listen and to care. Do you remember the scene in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows right after Dobby dies? Harry wants to bury him, but refuses to use magic. Harry understands that in the face of grief, magic won't help. He doesn't need to fast forward through the mourning process. He needs to slow down and dig a grave. Have you ever wondered why Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb if he knew he'd be raising Lazarus from the dead in 5 more minutes? Maybe he was just feeling sad about how sad everyone else had been feeling for 4 crummy days while they waited for him to arrive. Or maybe Jesus' tears paved the way for the miracle somehow, as if his grief awakened his healing powers, or as if God had to feel our pain in order to know how to help us. I don't know. All I know is that Jesus didn't think it was a waste of time or a show of weakness to stop and weep. To weep with us and for us. Somewhere along the way, we got the message that if we're not happy and joyful, something is wrong with us. Something is wrong with our souls. And yet Jesus himself said, "Blessed are those who mourn." Even Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even Jesus expressed his feelings of abandonment. I once read a book by a man who had lost his wife, his child, and his mother, all in the same horrific car accident. He said that he had a dream one night, and in his dream, his grief was like the setting of the sun. The darkness was setting in as the sun disappeared over the horizon, and it terrified him. He felt he was going to be swallowed, so he ran westward, chasing after the sun, trying to escape the night creeping up behind him. But it was futile to keep chasing the sun. He would have to keep running. So finally he realized that if he stopped running away from the darkness, if he turned around to the east and let the nighttime of his sorrow take him over, he would be facing the right direction to eventually see the sunrise. Which reminds me, in a way, of the women who visit Jesus' tomb that Easter Sunday morning. I see in the women who visit the tomb with spices a certain sort of stubborn faithfulness. Because even in the dark, dark night of their despair and anguish, they keep showing up. They travel to the burial site where their hopes and dreams lay broken and splintered. They visit their grief. And I consider that to be a form of belief. I don't know if they at all suspected he wouldn't be there when they got to the tomb. I don't think so. If what they held on to wasn't exactly hope, it was certainly resistance. You can kill our Jesus, but we will follow him anyway, is what they were saying with their lovingly prepared spices. Do you see the significance of that? They were going to follow him even if he stayed dead. Is it still worth it to follow Christ's example, and adopt God's love for the world, even if things don't get better? Most days, I'm pretty dependent on optimism. I usually need to think that the sun is about to rise any minute now. But lament allows us to sit in the dark for a long time without running away. Lament puts things into perspective. It tells us that even if we don't make the difference we were hoping for, our love did make a difference, even if we can't see it yet. I don't want to become a professional mourner any more than you do. I want to spend my Christian life dressed in bright colors and dancing in the sunlight and smiling at God's goodness in God's beautiful world. But there will be times when we are asked to be pain bearers with Christ. As the Apostle Paul would put it, we share in his sufferings and one day share in his glory. There will be times we are asked to weep like Jesus, to stand alongside those who suffer, to postpone our urge to try and fix it, to cry with the brokenhearted and honor their grief. There will be times we need to honor our own grief. And when those times come, don't adopt a posture of denial or avoidance, because that's a way to give in to despair. Open the doors to your heart's sadness and trust that this is what it means to hope when you are broken. I'm not suggesting that you wallow in your sadness and refuse to go outside. If you are sad or depressed, it's definitely and always a good idea to tell someone. It's okay to get help, to get medicine, to get support. I'm just suggesting that you visit with your grief. Don't try to magic your way out of it. Lament. Pray with your tears. Wail if you must, because when you weep, God weeps with you. When you weep, God bends an ear to listen. When you lament, that means you have stopped pretending all is fine with you and all is well with the world. You have started asking for help to hope. And when you ask, the help will come, and perhaps without even noticing it, you will have begun to hope again. May you and I have the courage to be honest with God and with one another, even when the truth is dreary. And then, when we least expect it, perhaps in the anguish of our wandering, we will arrive at an empty tomb. We will encounter messengers from above delivering good news we never even expected. Whether these angels of mercy arrive today or a long time from now, whether they arrive in dramatic, unmistakable fashion, or whether they make subtle, fleeting appearances in your life, whether the hope in you is strong or whether all you can muster is a bit of resistance in the face of evil, either way, the love with which you face your life is worth it. Amen.
Thank you very much, Kyndall. Thank you, band, for sharing with us this morning, and thank you all for being here with us. Remember, tomorrow morning, 9:40, we'll have another chapel service. We'd love to see you here.